welcome everyone to the session Beyond the Crises. The growing inequalities of our cities have been laid bare by the pandemic induced crisis, but how do we move beyond the cycle of risk crisis relief and think of support systems for a just and inclusive urbanism beyond crisis? For this session, we'll have Dr. Anant Maringanti, Director Hyderabad Urban Lab, as our moderator. He'll be joined by Dr. G.V. Ramanjanelu, who's the Executive Director of Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Joining him will be Gautam Bhan, loved by his students at IIHS and also known as an activist. I hand this session over to Dr. Anant Maringanti.
Thank you, Vanshika. Welcome, Gautam and Ramu. This has been a conversation which has been long pending. Gautam, you remember in one of the early conversations we had after the lockdown began, one thing that you said stuck in my mind for a very long time. You said, one of the things that you were realizing was that the virus was only one of the pathways to death, that there are many other pathways, which is basically to say that there are all kinds of vulnerabilities, all kinds of hazards in living in cities and elsewhere. And since then, over the last 8 months, the conversation has moved from vulnerability to the disease, the unknowns of the disease, the starvation, the hunger. How do we find out where is hunger stuck in the city? From there, slowly we are moving towards a situation where we are beginning to think about how do we build in now securities, protections for people who are vulnerable. So in some sense, the question is, if the pandemic has made us aware of, much more acutely aware of, all of our failings, all of our fractures, all of our weaknesses in our structures, what do we do now? And Ramu, if you remember, one of the early conversations that we had when people were going back was when you told me that the conversations that you were having as the chief functionary of Center for Sustainable Agriculture with farmers and farming households across the region, people were constantly telling you, you said that the memory of demonetization was very deeply etched on their minds. And the question that they were asking is it even really worth our while going back to the cities? And what we were wondering about at that point was, if people choose not to come back to the cities, or if people cannot come back to the cities because there is not enough work, and we are finding that actually panning out now, that there are many people in the cities who are actually underemployed. And one of the most striking things that is coming through in many places, Gautam and Ramu, both of you will know this, is not so much a question of unemployment, but a question of underemployment, that people don't have enough jobs, enough work to occupy them fully. The question then is, in all of these thousands of farm-based, off the farm, some distance away from the farm in structural ways, what are these households thinking? What do they want to do? Where do they want to go? What kinds of options can we create for people? So given this broader background of these two conversations, which are happening parallelly, it'll be really lovely if we can bring these two strands together, with Gautam thinking through what is happening in cities and what can be done, and with Ram thinking through and figuring out what needs to be done in the rural areas. So I would request Ramu to start us off by making perhaps a statement of what you think are the key issues that are emerging at this point of time for the hundreds of thousands of households which have, which are connected to the farm, to varying degrees in varying multiple ways, and they diversify the household in terms of livelihood. Some people doing subsistence agriculture within the same household, while others go away to the town. What is happening, and where do you think we should be headed from here? So, Ramu, Then I hand this to you, and then Gautam will try and figure out how to respond to that. Ramu, can you hear me?
Yeah, connecting these two issues is very important. See, when the current government came in 2014, they said they will double the farmers' income. One of the serious crises is the income in the rural areas is going low and low, and today probably it's lowest at its lowest in the history. Average household income is around 8,000 rupees, is what we are hearing at the national level. Then it varies across the states, and within the state also it varies across the socio-economic communities. If you look at the access to resources and then the facilities available in the area, say West Godavari farmers income may be very different compared to an Anantapur farmer. So that's the kind of situation in which people are. When household income being very low is an issue, and that income also comes from 5 6 different sources, and the balancing act between these 5 6 sources and then getting skilled in these 5 6 areas is a responsibility of the individual, and that's where actually the whole crisis comes in, and then there is no support from anyone on that. So in the process of trying to look for options, people migrate and then do all what they are trying to do. Unfortunately, government said they will double the farmers' income in 7 years. So by next year, so by 2022, the incomes are supposed to double. And if it gone well, it would have been 20% growth every year, and it is less than 3% which has happened. So we can imagine it has to happen something like 80 to 90% in the next 2 years, and which is not going to happen. And that's a deep crisis. And what we are seeing is a fallout of that. So government, all initiatives have not worked, and that created a lot of mistrust. And today, if you're seeing agitations of farmers also is because of that. So there's no trust on the government and its initiatives, which has happened because of the way demonetization was carried out, because of the way doubling the farmers' income initiatives have carried out, because of the way lockdown was carried out. So in all these things, the impact was on the most vulnerable communities, and it never addressed that. So the key challenge today is how do we address the income issue is the one issue. Second, the assumption that in the last 60 years, the assumption was that it trickle down works. So if the farming grows, labor also will get better prices, kind of thing. That also didn't work. And farmers also are not getting better prices, and anyway, whatever they got, it also couldn't get transferred to the labor. So that's the second problem which has happened. Third, very important issue which happened in the rural areas is most of the livelihoods, the caste-based livelihoods are displaced with industry. If you talk dairy, if you talk carpentry, if you talk any of these livelihoods are displaced, and they used to have most of the income used to come from their caste-based occupations, and part of the income used to come from 1 acre, half acre, which they had. And today, the income from the caste occupations has gone, and only this small piece of land has become the entire livelihood for them, and which is not sufficient anyway. And that's a large number of small and marginal farmers in this country. That's another major problem. And people who hold the land moved out of farming, and they still hold the land. And unfortunately, in India, anyone can be called themselves as farmers, right from the home minister to the chief minister to the local collector. Everybody can call themselves as farmers and hold the land, and then they can get benefit of all support systems. What farmer get, they can get, because all support systems are connected to that one. So this has created more vulnerability for these people. So that's a background of in which these migrations happen, and then they are still getting unorganized, and then they look for opportunities, kind of thing. And this is continuing for quite a long time. And that's what we have seen during the COVID period. So Kharif, many of them who hold the small pieces of land want to go back home and then do some farming for the Kharif season. And for Rabi season, they come back again, kind of thing. So this is the kind of situation in which they are. So this needs a serious discussion. This needs a serious thinking in terms of how these communities can be supported so that they can move towards a more stable, sustainable livelihoods kind of thing. So from an unorganized, how they can move into an organized, a little bit organized, at least they can organize themselves. Can we look at from an unskilled to skilled work so that they can also get a better income, better and stable incomes kind of. I think that is something which is very, very critical. If day to day, if they have to look for their food, if they have to look for their income, they have to look for their education, children's education, they have to look for their children's health, and if everything is uncertain, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. And we are continuing that like that. And I think this is the time, at least as a society, we should discuss about this. And whatever crisis we are seeing in the urban areas is tightly linked to the rural areas. So basically, why people come to urban areas, they come in terms of looking for a better opportunity because they are unable to get in the rural areas. And when they come here and when there is no opportunity here, again, they try to go back. So this is a kind of thing which is happening. Many times, they prefer to be in the rural areas because the risk is low. The risk in urban areas is much higher. And so risk is lower in the rural areas. So that is something which they go back. It is not that they have a lot of affinity because they don't actually have any land there. They might not have any attachment to the area, but it's actually the low risk. And then for their skills, they can find something else at least. Whereas here in urban areas, if they can't get that one job, then there is nothing else available. Kind of. So opportunities, if can be created in the rural areas, are better. And basic minimum social security systems, if we can think of. I think for them, if daily living is not an issue, life threatening vulnerabilities, if they can be taken out, then finding opportunities can become better for them. I think that's what the framework we need to think of.
Okay. Gautam, do you want to respond to this from your work in Delhi?
Let me come at it from a couple of ways. I think one of them is, for example, Ramu talked about wage stagnation. I think it's really important to think a little bit about the wage profiles of urban India equally in a sense of this kind of crisis, right? Which is, if you take Delhi, which is one of the richest city regions in the country, according to the last PLFS data we have from 2018-19, 70% of the city workers make under 15,000 rupees a month. Right? And this is a city region where the minimum wage for semi-skilled work is 16,000 rupees a month. So 70% of workers, not household income, but workers are under 15,000 a month. And you compare this, of course, to the cost structure of living in a city like Delhi, right? So you have to think about it also relatively what that number means. And there's a reason why the urban poverty lines are higher. Like Ramu was saying, the profile of risk is different, even if the profile of opportunity is different. And I think those two together are really important to see. And I think one of the things that 2020 really showed us is precisely that these geographies of risk and vulnerability and the way they trade off with opportunity in the urban, we have to understand this trade-off. Right? And I think there are periods of time in economic cycles where the trade-off tilts in favor of opportunity. And then there are periods where it tilts in favor of vulnerability. And I think that when we talk about, a lot of people have been saying this year, what we need is better social protection. What we need is better social security. And I want to sort of emphasize that there are two parts of thinking about social protection. One is what is called by scholars in the field protective or preventive social protection. Right? These are your nets. Don't fall below this. It's destitution prevention. And the other part of social protection, however, is what is called transformative social protection. And transformative social protection is about building opportunity, right? The idea of our safety nets is not just that you should avoid utter destitution. They must also give some foundation for a certain thriving, a certain flourishing, right? So if you take, for example, the Amartya Sen framework of basic capabilities, You weren't meant to stop at basic capabilities. You were meant to move to what he called flourishing and thriving as the point of the developmental function.
I mean,
And I think
that's the difference between poverty line and the dignified living wage, right? Poverty
absolutely
line
right.
is about not
So
starving.
absolutely. And in India, poverty lines have long been destitution lines. I mean, we literally calculated them for a long time as the number of kilocalories for biological reproduction. Not even for, especially given the new NFHS health survey data showing chronic stunting and malnutrition and wasting, not changing over the last 5 years. You think about that poverty line really as not even a notion of nutrition, but a notion of biological survival. And I think this goes back to the point that you were raising, Anant, about there are many ways to death. And I think that there are, one of the things that we have really thought about in urban areas is about the fundamental misrecognition, and this is a word that has stayed with me through the year, the misrecognition of the actually existing conditions of urban life for a majority of our citizens. It's a misrecognition of how people live, where they live, in what housing conditions they live, how they earn, what kind of work they do. And so a lockdown that says stay at home, work at home, when 8 of 10 workers work in the informal economy and half of them work in public space, is a misrecognition of the conditions of urban life, right? You basically uttered a farman that was unfollowable. Right? And so therefore what mattered is that you had workers who were forced to violate lockdown conditions, put themselves at health risk in order to offset livelihood risk. And that, I think, is that kind of disjunct is what has come out to that we've seen this year. But it goes back to the point that Ramu was saying, is that this precedes COVID. The rupture precedes the pandemic, right? And I think if you think about the question we should be asking is, what is the distinction between the crisis and the everyday? And my suggestion is actually that it is not a paradigmatic distinction. It is simply a distinction of degree, but not a distinction of kind, which means these trade-offs between health and livelihood, between flourishing and preventing destitution, between staying in place or migrating, these are the trade-offs of everyday life. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that the fact that there are trade-offs of everyday lives means that the systems of social protection that offset vulnerability have been consistently absent. Now, in health, this is known. India spends little over 1% of GDP on health. Right? Everyone knows this, and we have the lowest health spending among comparable countries and among developing countries. And we know the absence of those health systems. In fact, I mean, at least in rural areas, the National Rural Health Mission has stayed for a period of time. So in the health data, you can see that first contact for many people is now with the public system. In urban health areas, there's no equivalent urban health mission until very recently, and it's a skeleton. The same thing with Narega versus, the idea that the informal economy will keep absorbing endlessly and do the work for us in urban areas. So, I mean, I think that for me, one of the many things that I think about this year is to really underscore the continuity between the crisis and the everyday, to really think about why COVID and its lockdowns were livelihood crises and vulnerability crises and not just health crises. So our response was completely epidemiological. Our problem was not only epidemiological. But I have ideas in terms of practices we can talk about later, but I want to pick up just one point that Ramu mentioned on migration in the nation of mobility. I think it's really important to also understand that a lot of our new migration data is telling us that one of the largest growing segments demographically of migration is not just rural to urban, but is interurban, and particularly is between small towns, and it is from the small town to the larger cities. And I think it's important to remember a city like Bombay, for example, has had a decelerating rate of the increase in migration for many years now, right? And I think that, and a lot of the migration we're seeing is small town to small town, and small town to larger cities. And I think it's important to think about then the real differentiations between mobility between different centers. The Rajasthan Mahila Kamgar Union, one of the largest urban domestic worker unions in Jaipur, did a large scale survey of its members. And I think it's really interesting to think about those members. One of, 500 domestic workers in Jaipur, all migrants by technical definition, born elsewhere, hold ID cards of elsewhere, but all generational settled residents of Jaipur. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that even though they reported widespread distress in the first phone survey in April, none of them showed any indication of leaving. And we just did a follow-up survey, and they are all still there, right? 80% response all still, there's still no intention of leaving. So while I absolutely understand that 2020 has shown us how precarious the hold is for millions in cities, it's equally important to recognize that there is also a generation of urban-born, urban residing, call them semi-permanent migrants or residents, that are not cyclical and not moving. And I think we have to think about both those differentiations, about the people who are sticking it out. And they're sticking it out, and they do generationally do not have this relationship in terms of the return to the rural, though an equal number of have. So I just want to also introduce this layer within migration, because I think that it is no question that that what Ramu is saying is right about that movement, but that movement has layers. And the reason why people are leaving small towns is not the reason why they're leaving farms. So there is also a generation that is already one generation divorced from both the farm and from non-farm, non-agricultural farm employment in the rural areas, right? Which is about the changing nature of some parts of the rural economy as village hamlets aggregate into small towns, as you see urbanization deepen and not just remain to the megacities. So, that's my first set of thoughts on.
Thanks, Gautam. I just want to pick up on that last point as one of the connecting threads, and then there's another one which I'm seeing as a connecting thread. One of the things that I have sensed over the years in conversations with migrants in the city is this category that we can call semi-permanent, which is the population which takes about 7, 8, 9, 10 years maybe to figure out where they belong. And many of them tell you that, if you don't figure it out in 10 years time where you belong, then you don't belong anywhere. It's a very clear sense that they have that you're messed up in both places. You try and take time for 10 years to figure this out. But whether within those 10 years or even after that, for a large number of people, I think the household is actually a multi-local one. And I think that's partly what Ramu is suggesting, that, you may have within this household in the rural, which is farm-based, someone who is actually semi-permanent, may have even been away for one whole generation in the city, but has a very strong connection to the farming practices, the life in the rural. There are exchanges, there are transactions that are taking place between them. And I think that's the thing that we sense in most of the migrant households in cities, at least definitely in Hyderabad. And I think that's the case in many places. So one part of this is possibly in small towns. And this is what actually brings me to this question that might be something worth pursuing for all of us. Given our preoccupation with protection from destitution as the only imagination that we have, given the fact that for a large number of people, and it's a very striking thing that Ramu has said, that there are no institutions that can tell you what to do, that can give you pathways. So each household is actually on its own trying to figure out what to do. And within each household, each individual is trying to figure out what he or she should be doing. Right? So if that's the case, or something like that is happening, then what kinds of new knowledges, what kinds of new institutions should we be trying to imagine? Because one of my biggest concerns is that very likely, neither in the rural area nor in the urban, whether we're looking at small towns or big cities, it is very likely that we actually do not have the institutions that can respond to this. We don't have the kind of knowledge production that needs to happen for people to be able to think about opportunity structures. If you can't see a structure within which you can imagine a set of opportunities, then those opportunities don't exist. Because for an opportunity to become useful, you need to be able to say to yourself that, look, I follow 1, 2, 3 rules, I'm going to be able to get 1, 2, 3 resources. I can tweak this rule in this particular manner, and I'm going to get that kind of an outcome. If I don't know that, then I really have nothing that I can gain from that structure. And I think that is one of the reasons why we are seeing actually a lot of distress. Definitely in Telangana, we see this all over the place. Definitely in many of the offline agricultural areas within this region, we see this with different kinds of relationships to markets, that the desperation that I can't actually imagine what I need to do to be able to get this kind of an outcome. That's very, very high. So what do we do about that? What have we learned about that in the last 1 year? And what can we do about that? Ramu, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think
Then,
you put it in a right way, Anand. I think, say, today, if you are seeing the Punjab farmers agitate, it's essentially in the same situation. They don't know if MSP is taken out, what they want to do. They don't know if paddy area has to come down, what else needs to be done. So that's a kind of situation. And if you put this along with what Gautam has said, we also have the second generation people in the urban areas who are migrant workers. So they also, so they may not even have a route to go back, kind of thing. So, like the landowners came to urban areas, but they still have roots in the rural areas as a land ownership. But they don't want to go back, but they only see it as a property. The workers who migrated to urban areas, they are not specialized in anything, so they don't know what else they can do, kind of thing. So they simply learn from their parents how to do a masonry work or probably do some other domestic work, kind of thing. And when these are closed, they don't know what else to do. So there, the better opportunity is seen only as going back to the villages. Even limited opportunities available. That's the kind of situation is what we are trying, we are observing. So we need to figure out new ways of dealing with this. Certainly, we need to figure out new ways of dealing with it, both in terms of institutional structures and the pathways. See, how do we build their knowledge and skill so that they can move on beyond social protection, right? So one is about creating a opportunity to deal with the current destitute situation, current situation. But beyond that, what else there needs to be done is a mechanism one need to deal with that. There should be some institutional mechanisms within the city which need to be dealt with. I would say even in the rural areas, that is something which is important. How long I'm going to be an unskilled labor? And then I ask for continuing the weeding the same way it is done for 100 years. And then it's a huge drudgery work. Still, I beg to continue like that, no transformation, kind of thing. So I think it's a new imagination of the creating opportunities is important, and creating a trust in that transformation is also very important. Today, the problem is every new intervention is pushing people into much worse situation. Nothing helped them to move up. Everything is only moving down. And for the people who have access to resources, they are always moving up, irrespective of what changes any of the government is making as a policy. But so this disparity is what is creating this kind of uncertainty for the people, and also mistrust. So from there, how do we move to a situation where there is a trust, and then that probably should move into a kind of institutional mechanism in cities where, say, people can go and talk to someone or ask someone. Say, there are so many youth in the urban areas who are coming from, either they're staying here or coming from rural areas. Actually, is there anywhere they can go and talk, say, what I can do, and then how I can improve my skill, or how I can resolve my problem? So nowhere. There's no dialogue around that. There is no there is support for such people available. So I think that is something we need to figure out. So probably leave aside the basic education, basic knowledge and skill. Even to talk to them, nothing is available. So only thing they look back is just go back, kind of. And that's a desperation. So that desperation is what is creating all the problem. So people are very desperate, and then if that doesn't work out, then there is a panic situation, and then which is getting into all kinds of problems which we are seeing today. So I think that's what I think we need to figure out a mechanism of working on this.
Gautam, you want to come in?
I think from the urban, I think about this a little bit differently. I think that there are seeds of practices all over in urban areas, which are led precisely by workers themselves. So I think if you, for example, see that in the absence of a housing market that has access to any legal affordable housing, what do workers do? They occupy land, they incrementally self-build housing, right? If you look at in deeply inadequate reservation urban areas for different kinds of markets that are not malls, what do workers do? They create natural markets, right, that are temporal and mobile, but they congregate, they find agglomerations, they find supply chains, they sell. I think in each example, whether it's housing or work or employment, there are already practices that come from with a lot of struggle, but with also deep knowledge and agency that are actually the cities we live in, right? So the most of the urban fabric of our cities and their practices are not designed by formal institutions of planning or of governance. We didn't make natural markets. That's why they're called natural markets. Yet all of us as citizens access precisely the natural markets that planning never created. So for me, the question is not so much of skilling. It is actually a removal of barriers to the kinds of practices that have created opportunities already. It is to push these barriers and say, A, it should not be so hard. B, it should not take this long, right? And the question is, if it was not so hard and it did not take so long, then we get to actually see the full possibility of what it means to create these markets, to create such housing, to really work. And this is not a narrative only of saying there's agency and in entrepreneurship and informality. Within informality, there is. But there are also very deep structural concerns where the cost of doing that kind of entrepreneurship is far too high. And so I think for me, the real question in urban areas is to say, can we take this moment and recognize that it was the Kirana store that saved us in the lockdown? Can we recognize that it was the structures of circulation that could navigate no matter what was happening that enabled people to survive? If we begin to really understand those practices and say, what would it mean to back self-built housing by workers? What would it mean to begin from natural markets? What would it mean to trust the institutions that workers have created, for example, and their practices as a base to think about what urban development should look like, right? And I think there are many, you can do this at a theoretical abstract level. You can argue that notions, for example, of the circular economy, which comes more from the ecological paradigm of development about the reuse of materials, you can also think about the circular economy as something that is a small loop economy within a particular market, right? Which talks actually about the fact that investment that circulates locally is absorbed differently by different workers. And I'm thinking that there are many, so for me, a lot of these questions of what knowledges, what institutions we need, I don't think that we're at a moment where we have to invent or offer new vocabulary. We have to actually turn back to the city itself and listen in a different way to those practices and understand what limits them and makes them vulnerable, and think about what it means to remove those hindrances. It actually means for a lot of folks that are within formal institutions or state planning to step aside and not think that they can create new institutions that then will offer the solution, but actually say we have institutions in urban areas. We need to give them the support that they need to grow. And I think we can do this in many kinds of ways. And some of the way, what does that support look like? For example, I think one of the things that you think about is what would it mean to basically think about the delivery of all the relief measures that you announced during the lockdown? Very specifically, the delivery. You announced cash grants for construction workers, but you realized that not enough of them were registered in most parts of the country. So even the relief you announced could not get to all those workers. Now, the question is, what is the institution that can increase the registration of construction workers, even in that given act, even if you don't change it, right? And you're still thinking of the state will do a survey, the labor department will do a survey, the next you will hire a private surveying agency to do the survey. All of them are still solutions that believe that the formal institutions are the one that actually run the city, and they aren't. The question we should be asking is, how do construction workers through a network of contractors build certain networks that actually is the only way to do large scale registration? Who are the unions, the federations, the organizations, the networks? What are the communication channels through which construction workers find contractors, find work sites, and show up? You don't match them. They are sophisticated systems of matching. And they are not, and it's not to romanticize those systems, because remember, those systems are also through which known fault lines of caste, religion, and region are perpetuated. So this is not an easy switch to say, give it to the give it to existing practices. Existing practices hold inequality just as much as formal planning practices. But that is the place one has to enter the arena, right? In some ways, it is to recognize those institutions and think about how they can grow. So to me, the two big questions that have come in terms of institutions and knowledge is, what kind of knowledge do we need? We need to understand existing everyday urbanism. We need to understand the ways in which workers move, organize, and reside better. We need to understand the nature of this multi-local life, right? That I heard this phrase for the first time when this Ahmedabad-based urbanist Renu Desai used it in a discussion on migration, and it just stuck with me, because what it means is that, the logics of people who live their entire life in urban areas and build the house in the rural area, like Ramu was saying, but see it as property and not something to return, right? They're leveraging all these investments in very different ways, which means we have to start thinking about systems that anticipate mobility, not that are not surprised by migration, that are not undone and then have an only distinction between portability and not. The question, even with portability, is what do systems look like that anticipate multi-local lives? That's our question. Our anxiety from state action is to literally tell people, make your movement definable, legible, and certain. So I know where you are or where you will go, and then I will know how to do it. That's not the game.
Because only then I can give you a ration card.
Only then I can give you a ration card, right? So the system still is, now I'm trying to tweak and tweak and tweak. So I think we have to really think of some fundamental reimaginations that begin from the real city and our actual everyday urbanism, not from the way, if you read our cities through their policies and their plans, it literally feels like they're describing a city that actually does not exist on paper. I mean, they create programs which assume households have wages, which assume that they have safety nets, which assume they stay in one place, which assume they have, it's like,
that they have balconies and terraces.
yes. I mean, like, we literally, I feel like sometimes all our formal institutional planning is for the city we wish we had. It is not for the city we actually have. And you begin from that disjunct, and then you say actually the policy was fine, but there was an implementation gap. I mean, never have two words done more damage to understanding than implementation gap. It's like you design and take practices from the world. Again, if you say 8 out of 10 workers work in the informal economy, half of them work in public space, 70% of workers in Delhi make less than 15,000 rupees a month. These three parameters of the actual city, right? 2/3 of them live in housing that has some kind of tenure insecurity. These parameters should be from where we design our practices. And they are simply not part of the response when we think about—
Hold that thought, Gautam, for a moment. Ramu, does this resonate with the way in which you have been thinking about agriculture?
Yes, see, it's the same story in the rural areas as well. But just to add on, when people try to find their own pathways, the constraint, they try to find solutions. So these are urban areas, like what Gautam mentioned. So from that, how do we link them to the formal systems is something which is very important. Both are important. When people innovate in terms of institutional models or in terms of opportunities, create their own markets, create their own institutions kind of thing. How do we learn from that? And then how those things can get connected to the formal institutions, and then formal knowledge systems is also very, very important. I see from a rural point of view, say, for example, when we talk about organic farming, people try to find their own ways of dealing with farming, but mainstream institutions never accept that one. And replacing the entire modern knowledge and then saying what farmers figured out is always good also doesn't work, because many times when people try out, it also has a lot of knowledge gaps, because they do based on their own understanding of that situation. So there could be some gap, there could be belief systems, there could be some ideologies, so all those kind of things. But when we are trying to make it formal, there's a role which farmers knowledge systems, formal institution systems also should play. This is one issue. Second issue is, as far as the public institutional interventions are concerned, they actually cause the distortion. See, they also don't allow the informal economy to grow on its own, and then it won't allow people to figure out how to do. So laws like this come in, certainly. So today, if you look at these farm laws, it may create a lot of distortion in terms of impacting on, say, the more regulation we are asking, that regulation also comes on informal markets, and suddenly all these informal markets may suddenly vanish. It also can happen. So I think during that situation, how do we deal with that is also very important issue. So we need to reimagine, certainly, in terms of how do we deal with these things. Both are important. So in that situation, what is the new way of dealing with that is important.
Great. Thanks, Ramu and Gautam. I think we have some answers, but we have also a lot more questions. I want to open this up to hear if any of the people in the room will have some questions. We have about 10 minutes in which we can quickly take the question. But I also want to say to everyone that this entire conversation is on Facebook Live on HUL page. So this is a conversation that we really need to take forward. So please do check it out and then leave your comments, questions there, and we will all be looking at it. I'm sure both Ramu and Gautam also will be looking at it and responding to it later.
Yeah, sure.
So
We have a few comments on Facebook.
Yeah.
I can read them out.
Can you quickly? Yeah.
Yeah, we have Saransh Sugandh who's asking, are we counting the coming up of census towns as the examples of urbanization? What are we taking as the basic definition of an urbanized setting? He's also asking, but isn't this precarity of movement that is mined to keep the manpower costs low across sector, whether construction or brickmaking?
No, I don't think it's just census towns. I think that there is clear evidence of, one, just an increasing urbanization from the what we would call natural growth, right? Which is sort of a lock-in in terms of the way cities are growing. And you see the built environment footprint of cities growing through. So existing urban regions are getting larger. Certainly some what was called in the Indian census very large village category. So India has a very longer answer, because India has a very peculiar governmental definition of urban that has an employment condition, right? 75% of men have to be in non-agricultural employment. And that has actually always kind of undercounted our actual urbanization. We have always been more urban than we have said, in addition to the census town, statutory town kind of question. So the urban in India, unfortunately, is a very governmental definition as a bureaucratic category. It's not actually a category, say, around density or population, and that is in most of the world. But there is, I think, also a different way you can read Saransh's question, which is about, if you read the urban not just as a demographic or spatial bound where there is a municipality or not, but as a changing structure of the economy, as a changing relationship to built form, then there is also a way in which many built environments in the country are urban by character, even if not by governmental definition. And I think I would particularly look at the different ways in which the structure of employment and economic output shifts and the structure of the built environment shifts. And I think those two ways are one way to think and track the urban. And I think that the question of mobility, so I think that yes, there are structural ways in which a lot of this notion of mobility in terms of controlling the labor market, there are ways in which that fits certain explanations. But I personally tend to favor labor market explanations that give much more agency to the people moving than those trying to control their movement. And I think that's, to me, India's labor market movement has long confounded economic explanations of why workers move within labor markets, whether you're neoclassical or completely Marxist. Like both sides of economics are not able to explain our labor market movements, right? Because we also have deep complexities on culture and language and other things that shape our mobilities in ways that are not easily reducible to just economic structural explanations of control. I think that's important. But I think one of the things that is certainly, for example, shaping our mobility patterns is what kind of life is possible in cities, not just in terms of the opportunity vulnerability trade-off, but literally infrastructurally, right? So Bombay has been losing migrants for a long period of time because it is simply impossible infrastructurally to make a dignified life in the city. And no amount of opportunity can offset that, right? So there are certainly questions here where the idea, and this is where you connect to saying, what attracts or makes a viable city region and its political economy? And we have long really said, just create, a certain way of thinking of urban economics says create economic opportunity, create economic opportunity. What this year is telling us is the infrastructures of protective social protection are equally important ways in which to create not just and equitable city regions, but economically vibrant city regions. That actually social protection is a good medium-term, long-term economic strategy. And there, then you have to think, I think, in some ways, of imaginations of urban development that choose other aspirational paradigms other than a certain high service, high GDP, but low employment economic model that we have locked ourselves into. And instead of think of things like circular economies, think of things like, one of the things is that especially the mega city regions, are large enough economic units autonomously to not need to play always the global, multi-scalar, and utterly expanding zone of endless wealth creation through high output, low employment trajectory. So I think this match, thinking of urban development paradigms saying one doesn't want high output, low employment. One wants, in a sense, high employment, medium output, high employment, high output trajectories. They're available. But the aspirational language and the current political economy makes those imaginations seem almost radical, right? They're not. They're actually very, very viable and they're very present. So there is
Actually, real. They already are there.
They're already there, but they're already there and we have to begin to sort of lean into them, right? The last thing I'll say is, I think for me, when we start thinking about a move, for example, like I was saying, removing the barriers to those kinds of practices, to me, there are two ways in which that has to happen. One, opportunity has to be expanded, but the other is that the protection has to be strengthened. You need both of these, because only expanding opportunity plays into a certain urban development logic model also, right? It's enterprise, enterprise, enterprise. So informality becomes the new enterprise. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you have to build the opportunity that people are growing, which is incremental and connected to their lifestyle. But you also have to it cannot be done without a clear moral and ethical commitment to strengthening the foundations of their everyday life. You cannot support workers at work and not support them at home. Right? I mean, that's partly what I'm saying about those two kinds of conditions, that it is about these two moves, about strengthening social protection in its protective and preventive way. And for that, there is one single argument I have to make. If we continue to imagine social protection as food and cash and pension and not include housing, it is not urban social protection at all. I think this is one simple thing. We've got to include housing. If you include housing and transport into urban poverty lines, you get a completely different picture of urban vulnerability, even in the data. That's the shift we have to make.
Vanshika, do we have any other comments from Facebook?
No, not as yet. Not as yet. I think people might just be taking their time to soak the session in.
Yeah, it was actually a very intense session. So, Ramu and Gautam, any final thoughts to be wrapped up in just under 1 minute each?
No, I think Gautam has already summarized it very well, and I think it's important to look at a holistic approach to support the shift which is happening as urbanization, because when people are coming to urban areas for work and then they tend to stay back, how the institutions which they already create or the systems which they create, how they can be further strengthened rather than replacing them. I think that's the approach government should look at. And both in terms of housing as well as the social protection which we may have to create. I think that's something which is important. But at the same time, like I said, see, the knowledge and skill building of these people is also very, very critical. So how long, how that systems can be plugged into these things is what we need to figure out. So in a situation where they have vulnerability, and then how long they continue with the same kind of very uncertain livelihoods, because tomorrow they'll be replaced with all kind of machinery. So obviously, say the entire construction workers opportunities may go off. So that's given that kind of situation, how long they are going to continue with the same kind of risky lives is something which is important. So we need to have some kind of planning for that also. So that needs actually not only the informal solutions, but also formal institutional solutions also. So that's where future of the cities lie.
I mean, one of the most bizarre things that we've seen in Hyderabad in the last 4 months is people saying that with expenditure on weddings coming down, a large number of people have actually lost opportunities to earn. Every time you have a feast for 2,000 people, easily 200 people are employed as valet drivers, as stewards, and so on. And many of them actually college students who are in the city with part of their family.
Part of time, yeah. True.
The part of the family is in the village. They're here. They make that little bit of extra money during the wedding season to be able to get on with life. So, all right. Thank you very much, Gautam and Ramu. This has been, as I said, a very long pending conversation. And I'm really hoping that we will be able to take this forward, because for me, one of the big links between the two, which we haven't fully articulated yet, is we know what kind of knowledge needs to be generated, what kinds of attitudes we need to do, but what kinds of institutions do we need, what kind of learning platforms do we need to create, and how do we build them in sufficient numbers and in sufficient sizes for them to actually make a difference. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for us, and we do need to continue that conversation into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Anand. Thanks,
folks.
Gautam. It was wonderful listening to you.
See you, Ramu. Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of the event, everybody, and see you in the other sessions.
Vanchika, do you want to say something?
Yes, we'll meet next at 12:15 for the session Dobara. This is about geriatric care and infrastructures for the elderly, especially in the times that we are in. So 12:15, the session begins. The Zoom links are there. You can also join us on Facebook. Thank you everyone for joining us for this session on Zoom as well as Facebook. If there are comments that come in late, we'll let our panelists know as well. Thank you.
Bye, Gautam.
Bye. Bye, Tashi.